2 years after the historic parliamentary vote, Botswana had become unrecognizable to those who remembered the quiet, cattle-ranching nation it had once been. President Masisi stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, representing a country that now ranked among the world's top suppliers of critical minerals for renewable energy technology. His speech about sustainable development and African economic empowerment received a standing ovation from delegates who had previously paid little attention to his small nation. Sarah Modise had been promoted to Regional Operations Manager, overseeing mining activities across 3 different sites. Her success story had been featured in international business magazines as an example of how African workers could rapidly advance in high-technology industries when given proper training and opportunities. Her children attended the best schools in Botswana, and her eldest daughter had received admission offers from universities in both South Africa and the United States. The economic statistics told an extraordinary story of transformation. Botswana's GDP had increased by 40% in just 2 years, unemployment had fallen to historic lows, and government revenues had reached levels that allowed for massive investments in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. The country's foreign currency reserves had grown so large that financial experts were advising diversification into international investment funds. Dr. Chen Wei-Ming had become something of a celebrity in both Botswana and his native Singapore, recognized as the visionary who had identified the mineral wealth that transformed an entire nation. His consortium's Botswana operations were now cited as the global standard for sustainable mining practices, with delegations from around the world visiting to study their environmental management and community engagement strategies. Chief Kagosi Tawana had embraced his role as a cultural ambassador for the mining project, working with the consortium to ensure that traditional practices and sacred sites were respected throughout the development process. His village had been transformed by new schools, medical facilities, and economic opportunities, while maintaining its cultural identity and traditional governance structures. The environmental success of the mining operations had surprised even optimistic projections. Independent monitoring showed that wildlife populations in the mining regions had actually increased due to conservation programs funded by mining revenues. Water quality had improved thanks to advanced treatment technologies, and air pollution remained well below international standards despite the scale of industrial activity. Thabo Mogale's transportation company had grown into one of the largest logistics operations in southern Africa, with contracts extending beyond Botswana into neighboring countries. His success had inspired hundreds of other local entrepreneurs who were building businesses that served the mining industry and the prosperous communities it had created. The political landscape had evolved significantly as the success of the mining project created new dynamics within Botswana's democracy. Opposition leader Dumalung Salashando had shifted his focus to ensuring that mining wealth was invested in long-term development rather than short-term consumption. His constructive criticism had actually strengthened the government's policies and increased public confidence in the project's management. International recognition of Botswana's transformation reached new heights when the country was invited to join the G20 as an observer nation. This unprecedented honor for a small African country reflected the global importance of Botswana's mineral resources and the sophisticated manner in which the nation was managing its newfound wealth. The consortium announced plans for a third processing facility that would focus on producing advanced battery components rather than raw materials. This move up the value chain represented another leap forward for Botswana's economic development, creating higher-skilled jobs and generating even greater revenues from the country's mineral resources. Pastor John Mullify had adapted his ministry to address the spiritual challenges that accompanied rapid economic change. His church now hosted financial literacy programs and counseled families navigating newfound prosperity. The pastor had become an important voice advocating for responsible stewardship of Botswana's mineral wealth and ensuring that success did not compromise the country's values. The university system had expanded dramatically, with new campuses and research facilities making Botswana a regional center for mining and environmental technology education. Students from across Africa now came to study in programs that combined traditional academic subjects with practical training in sustainable resource management. President Masisi's approval ratings had reached historic highs as Botswanans recognized that the controversial mining deal had delivered on its promises. The president used his enhanced political capital to launch additional initiatives in renewable energy, technology development, and regional economic integration that would further strengthen Botswana's position as an African leader. The transformation had not been without challenges. Rapid economic growth had created housing shortages in some areas, and income inequality had initially increased before government programs began redistributing mining revenues more broadly. However, these growing pains were managed through policy adjustments and continued dialogue between government, industry, and community representatives. As the story of Botswana's remarkable transformation spread around the world, other African nations began reassessing their own mineral resources and development strategies. The success of the $12 billion mining deal had demonstrated that African countries could be equal partners with international investors rather than passive recipients of foreign investment. The future looked incredibly bright for this small landlocked nation that had dared to embrace a vision of prosperity that once seemed impossible. Sarah Modise, Chief Kagosi Tawana, Dr. Chen Wei-ming, and millions of other Botswanans had witnessed their country's emergence as a global power, proving that with the right decisions, determination, and partnerships, even the most ambitious dreams could become reality. The story of Botswana's $12 billion deal had shocked the world not just because of its financial magnitude, but because it demonstrated that African nations could successfully manage complex international partnerships and transform their economies while preserving their values and protecting their environment. The small nation had shown the world a new model for development that would inspire countries and communities for generations to come. 6 months after the parliamentary vote, the transformation of Botswana began in earnest. The first convoy of heavy machinery arrived at the port of Durban in South Africa before making the long journey inland to Botswana's northern mining sites. Sarah Modise, who had been selected for a management training program funded by the mining consortium, watched the massive trucks pass through Gaborone on their way to change her country forever. The training program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Over 3,000 Botswanans had enrolled in courses covering everything from advanced engineering to environmental management. Sarah found herself studying alongside former cattle ranchers, university graduates, and experienced diamond mine workers, all preparing for careers in an industry that would define their nation's future. Dr. Chen Wei-ming had relocated to Botswana permanently, establishing his headquarters in a gleaming new office complex on the outskirts of Gaborone. The building symbolized the modernization sweeping across the country, featuring solar panels, water recycling systems, and other technologies that the consortium was introducing throughout their operations. Chief Kagosi Tawana experienced the changes firsthand when construction crews arrived in his traditional territory. However, the disruption was far less dramatic than he had feared. The mining consortium had kept its promises about preserving cultural sites, and several of his villagers had secured high-paying jobs with the project. The chief found himself cautiously optimistic about developments that had once filled him with dread. The economic impact became visible almost immediately. Local businesses in the mining regions reported unprecedented demand for services ranging from accommodation to equipment repair. Thabo Mogal's transportation company had expanded to employ over 200 people, and he was negotiating contracts that would triple his revenue within 2 years. International attention continued to focus on Botswana's remarkable transformation. Delegations from other African countries arrived regularly to study how this landlocked nation was managing its mineral windfall. Ghana, Zambia, and Tanzania sent representatives to learn about Botswana's approach to revenue management and community engagement. The environmental monitoring results provided welcome relief to critics who had worried about ecological damage from the mining operations. Independent scientists confirmed that the consortium's advanced extraction techniques were indeed minimizing environmental impact, with some areas actually showing improved biodiversity thanks to habitat restoration programs funded by mining revenues. President Masisi faced new challenges as Botswana's growing prominence attracted unwanted attention from neighboring countries and global powers. Intelligence reports suggested that certain regional actors were concerned about Botswana's rapidly increasing economic and strategic importance. The president quietly increased security measures while maintaining his country's traditionally peaceful foreign policy. The first major test of the mining project's promise came when the consortium announced the opening of their processing facility. The state-of-the-art plant would transform raw lithium and rare earth ores into refined materials, ready for use in electric vehicle batteries and solar panels. This value-added processing represented the difference between selling commodities and participating in the global technology supply chain. Sarah Modis's life had changed dramatically since completing her management training. She now supervised a team of 50 workers at the processing facility, earning more money than she had ever imagined possible. Her children attended a new school built with mining revenues, and her eldest daughter had received a scholarship to study engineering at university. Religious leader Pastor John Molfi watched the changes in his community with mixed emotions. The new prosperity had reduced poverty and created opportunities, but it had also brought social challenges as traditional family structures adapted to rapid economic change. His church had grown significantly as people sought guidance in navigating their transformed circumstances. The mining consortium faced its own growing pains as the scale of operations expanded beyond original projections. Demand for processed minerals had increased so rapidly that Chen's team was already planning a second processing facility and additional extraction sites. The $12 billion initial investment was proving to be just the beginning of a much larger commitment to Botswana. Local universities experienced unprecedented growth as mining revenues funded expanded engineering and geology programs. The University of Botswana partnered with international institutions to establish research centers focused on sustainable mining technologies and environmental management. These investments would ensure that future generations of Botswanans had the skills to manage their country's mineral wealth independently. The success story attracted some unwelcome attention from international criminal organizations interested in Botswana's newfound wealth. Security consultants advised the government to strengthen border controls and financial monitoring systems to prevent money laundering and other illegal activities. President Masisi authorized significant investments in law enforcement and intelligence capabilities. Opposition leader Dumalang Salishando found his political position complicated by the mining project's obvious success. His party's traditional criticisms of government economic policies seemed outdated when unemployment was falling rapidly and living standards were rising across the country. Salishando adapted by focusing on ensuring that mining benefits were distributed equitably rather than questioning the project itself. The transformation of Botswana's international profile accelerated when major automotive manufacturers announced plans to establish supply chain partnerships with the country's mining consortium. Tesla, Toyota, and General Motors all signed agreements to source critical materials from Botswana, bringing global recognition to this previously overlooked African nation. Dr. Chen Wei-Ming reflected on the remarkable progress as he prepared quarterly reports for consortium investors. The Botswana project had exceeded all expectations, both financially and operationally. More importantly, it was demonstrating that African countries could be equal partners in global technology supply chains rather than merely sources of raw materials. As the first anniversary of the parliamentary vote approached, President Masisi began planning celebration events that would showcase Botswana's transformation to the world. The country that had once been known primarily for diamonds and wildlife was emerging as a critical player in the global transition to sustainable energy, with revenues and strategic importance that would continue growing for decades to come. The parliamentary session that would determine Botswana's future began on a sweltering Monday morning. Members of Parliament filed into the Assembly Hall, each carrying thick folders containing technical reports, environmental assessments, and economic projections related to the proposed mining deal. The tension in the room was palpable, as representatives from across the country prepared to debate what many considered the most important decision in Botswana's modern history. Opposition leader Dumalang Salishando stood to address the assembly first. His voice carried the weight of skepticism as he questioned whether Botswana had the institutional capacity to manage such an enormous project without falling victim to corruption and mismanagement. He pointed to examples from other African countries where mineral wealth had enriched a few individuals, while leaving the majority of citizens in poverty. President Masisi listened carefully to each concern raised by the opposition. He understood that their questions were not just political maneuvering, but reflected genuine fears shared by many Botswanans. When his turn came to respond, he spoke with quiet confidence about the safeguards built into the agreement, including international oversight mechanisms and mandatory transparency reporting. Meanwhile, in the northern regions where mining would take place, community leaders were holding their own meetings to discuss the potential impact on their daily lives. Chief Gosi Tawana had called together elders from 12 villages to share their concerns and hopes about the project. The discussions revealed deep divisions within communities, as younger people generally supported the mining project while older residents worried about losing their traditional way of life. Mary Kibonye, a young teacher in one of the affected villages, found herself torn between excitement and anxiety. The mining project promised to bring schools, hospitals, and job opportunities to her remote community. But she also worried about the influx of foreign workers and the potential disruption to the close-knit social fabric that had sustained her people for generations. Back in Gaborone, international observers arrived to monitor the parliamentary proceedings. Representatives from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and several African development organizations came to assess whether Botswana was prepared for such rapid economic transformation. Their presence added another layer of pressure to an already intense situation. Dr. Chen Wei-Ming spent his days meeting with technical committees, answering detailed questions about extraction methods, environmental protection measures, and job creation timelines. His patience was tested repeatedly as politicians and experts challenged every aspect of his consortium's proposal. However, Chen remained committed to transparency, knowing that trust was essential for the project's long-term success. The Environmental Review Committee presented findings that surprised many observers. Independent scientists confirmed that the proposed mining methods would actually have less environmental impact than traditional diamond mining operations that had sustained Botswana's economy for decades. Advanced techniques would allow for precise extraction, with minimal disturbance to surrounding ecosystems. Local businessman Thabo Mogal received unexpected news when his bank approved a major loan expansion that would allow him to purchase additional trucks and equipment. The bank manager, clearly anticipating the mining deal's approval, encouraged Thabo to move quickly to position his company as a key logistics provider. This vote of confidence from the financial sector reflected growing optimism about the project's prospects. Religious leaders continued to play an important role in community discussions about the mining project. Pastor John Molifi organized interfaith dialogues where Christians, Muslims, and traditional religious practitioners came together to discuss the moral implications of accepting such enormous wealth. These conversations helped many people work through their conflicted feelings about the opportunity. Student protests erupted at the University of Botswana as young people demanded greater involvement in decisions that would shape their future. However, these demonstrations were notably different from protests in other countries. They focused on ensuring transparency and accountability rather than opposing the mining project outright. The students wanted guarantees that mining revenues would fund education and create opportunities for young Botswanans. International mining companies made desperate last-minute attempts to disrupt the deal with the Asian consortium. A Canadian company offered a competing proposal with slightly better financial terms, while an Australian firm promised faster project implementation. However, President Masisi remained committed to the original agreement, believing that Chen's consortium had demonstrated the most comprehensive understanding of Botswana's needs and capabilities. Sarah Modise, the single mother who had first heard rumors about the mining project, attended a community meeting where government officials explained how the deal would affect ordinary citizens. She learned about job training programs that would be available, scholarship opportunities for her children, and healthcare improvements that would come to her neighborhood. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future where her family would not struggle financially. The parliamentary Debate continued for 3 days with representatives examining every detail of the proposed agreement. Technical experts presented complex geological data, economists projected long-term revenue scenarios, and lawyers scrutinized contract language to ensure Botswana's interests were protected. The thoroughness of the review process impressed international observers and demonstrated the country's commitment to making an informed decision. As the final vote approached, President Masisi felt the weight of history on his shoulders. He knew that approving the mining deal would set in motion changes that could not be reversed, transforming Botswana from a quiet, stable nation into a major player in global mineral markets. The question was no longer whether the opportunity was real, but whether his country was ready to embrace such a dramatic transformation. The voting began at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday. Each member of parliament approached the ballot box with measured steps, knowing that their decision would echo through generations of Botswanan history. President Masisi sat in the gallery, his hands clasped tightly as he watched representatives from across the country cast their votes on the $12 billion mining agreement. The first surprise came from the rural constituencies. Representatives from traditional farming and cattle ranching communities voted overwhelmingly in favor of the mining project, despite predictions that they would oppose such dramatic change. These members of parliament had witnessed firsthand the economic struggles of their constituents and recognized that the mining revenues could fund rural development programs that had been postponed for decades. Opposition member HFY Stories shocked her own party by breaking ranks and supporting the mining deal. Standing before the assembly, she explained that her grandmother had worked in the diamond mines for 30 years and understood the transformative power of mineral resources. When managed properly, Nthomiwa's emotional speech about lifting her community out of poverty resonated even with her political opponents. Outside the parliament building, thousands of citizens gathered to await the results. Sarah Modise had taken time off work to join the crowd, bringing her 3 children to witness what she hoped would be a historic moment. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as people shared stories about how the mining project might change their lives. Chief Gosi Tawana arrived in Gaborone just as the voting concluded, having traveled from his village to personally observe the proceedings. Despite his initial concerns about the mining project, the chief had been impressed by the consortium's commitment to preserving cultural sites and involving traditional leaders in project planning. His presence in the capital demonstrated the gravity of the moment. Dr. Chen Wei-ming waited in his hotel room, surrounded by legal documents and technical reports. His consortium had invested 18 months and millions of dollars in geological surveys and feasibility studies, and everything now depended on the decision of 57 members of parliament. Chen's phone buzzed constantly with messages from investors and partners around the world, all eager to learn the outcome. The vote count proceeded with excruciating slowness as parliamentary officials verified each ballot. International journalists filled the press gallery, ready to broadcast news of Botswana's decision to financial markets and governments worldwide. The story of this small African nation's potential transformation had captured global attention, with stock prices of technology and automotive companies fluctuating based on speculation about the vote's outcome. Local businessman Thabo Mogale watched the proceedings from his office, where he had gathered his senior staff to discuss expansion plans that would only be possible if the mining deal was approved. His transportation company had already received inquiries from international contractors eager to begin preliminary work on the project, but everything remained contingent on parliamentary approval. When the final tally was announced, a collective gasp echoed through the assembly hall. 43 members had voted in favor of the mining agreement, with only 14 opposed. The margin of victory exceeded even President Masisi's most optimistic projections, demonstrating broad-based support for the project across party lines and geographic regions. The announcement triggered immediate celebrations in the parliament building and on the streets outside. Sarah Modise hugged her children as tears of joy streamed down her face, overwhelmed by the possibility that their lives might soon improve dramatically. Similar scenes played out across Gaborone as news of the vote spread through social media and radio broadcasts. President Masisi stood to address the assembly after the vote, his voice heavy with emotion as he thanked the members of parliament for their courage in embracing such a bold vision for Botswana's future. He promised that the mining revenues would be managed with the same prudence and transparency that had characterized the country's handling of diamond income over previous decades. Dr. Chen Wei-ming received the news with quiet satisfaction, rather than jubilation, understanding that parliamentary approval was only the first step in a complex process that would span several years. His consortium would now need to mobilize equipment, personnel, and funding on an unprecedented scale to fulfill their commitments to Botswana. The real work was just beginning. International reaction was swift and significant. The World Bank announced its willingness to provide technical assistance for managing the mining revenues, while the International Monetary Fund offered to help Botswana develop economic policies that would maximize the benefits of its newfound mineral wealth. These endorsements from prestigious international institutions validated the parliamentary decision and reduced concerns about the project's feasibility. Financial markets responded immediately to news of the vote. Share prices of companies involved in electric vehicle manufacturing and renewable energy technology surged as investors recognized that Botswana's mineral resources would help secure supply chains for critical materials. The small African nation had suddenly become strategically important to some of the world's largest corporations. Opposition leader Dumalang Salashando graciously accepted the outcome of the vote, pledging his party's cooperation in ensuring that the mining project would benefit all Botswanans. His statesmanlike response demonstrated the political maturity that had made Botswana one of Africa's most stable democracies, even in times of significant change and controversy. As the sun set over Gaborone on that historic Thursday evening, President Masisi stood on the balcony of his office, looking out over a city that would soon be transformed beyond recognition. The $12 billion mining deal would bring unprecedented prosperity, but it would also test every institution and value that had made Botswana successful. The real challenges lay ahead, but for now, the president allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic about his nation's extraordinary future. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kalahari Desert as President Mogwitsi Masisi sat in his office, staring at the documents that would change Botswana forever. The papers before him represented something nobody had expected: a deal worth $12 billion that would transform his small landlocked nation into a global powerhouse. Just 3 months earlier, Masisi had been facing the biggest crisis of his presidency. Botswana's economy was struggling, unemployment rates were climbing, and the opposition parties were calling for his resignation. The country that had once been one of Africa's success stories was now facing uncertain times. Diamond revenues, which had sustained the nation for decades, were declining as global demand shifted towards synthetic alternatives. The president rubbed his tired eyes and remembered the phone call that started everything. It was a Tuesday evening when his private secretary knocked on his door with an urgent message. An unknown businessman from Singapore wanted to meet with him about a revolutionary opportunity that could benefit Botswana. Masisi almost dismissed it as another get-rich-quick scheme, but something about the caller's credentials made him curious. Dr. Chen Wei-ming was not an ordinary businessman. He represented a consortium of Asian technology companies that had been quietly researching rare earth minerals for the past decade. What they discovered in satellite surveys of Botswana's northern regions had left them speechless. Beneath the seemingly barren landscape lay deposits of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements worth potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. When Chen first presented his findings to Masisi, the president thought it was too good to be true. The geological surveys showed mineral concentrations that exceeded even the richest deposits in China and Australia. But Chen's team had done their homework thoroughly, conducting secret ground surveys for 18 months before approaching the government. The initial meeting lasted 6 hours. Chen explained how the global transition to electric vehicles and renewable energy had created an unprecedented demand for these minerals. Countries worldwide were scrambling to secure reliable supplies, and Botswana was sitting on what could be described as the treasure chest of the 21st century. Masisi knew this discovery could either make or break his nation. The wrong decision could lead to environmental disaster and social upheaval. The right choice could lift 2 million Botswanans out of poverty and establish the country as a major player on the world stage. The president spent sleepless nights, weighing the options. He consulted with his closest advisors, economists, and environmental experts. The more research they conducted, the more convinced they became that this opportunity was legitimate and potentially transformative. Chen's consortium offered something unprecedented in African mineral deals. Instead of simply extracting raw materials and shipping them abroad, they proposed building complete processing facilities within Botswana. This would mean thousands of high-paying jobs, technology transfer, and value-added manufacturing that would benefit the local economy for generations. The environmental concerns were addressed through cutting-edge extraction technologies that minimized ecological impact. Chen's team had learned from the mistakes made in other countries and developed methods that were both profitable and sustainable. They even proposed creating nature reserves in areas not being mined, ensuring that Botswana's wildlife heritage would be protected. As word of the negotiations began to leak, international attention focused on this small African nation. Mining companies from Australia, Canada, and Europe suddenly showed interest in Botswana's mineral potential. The president realized he held the cards in what was becoming a global bidding war. The breakthrough came when Chen's consortium agreed to an unprecedented revenue-sharing arrangement. Unlike traditional mining deals where foreign companies took the majority of profits, this agreement would give Botswana 60% of all revenues. Additionally, the consortium committed to investing $3 billion in infrastructure development, including roads, schools, and hospitals. Masisi knew that signing this deal would change everything. The $12 billion initial investment was just the beginning. Industry experts estimated that over the next 30 years, the project could generate more than $200 billion in revenue. For a country with a GDP of less than $20 billion, these numbers seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The president looked out his window at the bustling streets of Gaborone, imagining how different they would look in just 5 years. The mining project would transform Botswana from a cattle ranching nation dependent on diamonds into a high-tech manufacturing hub that supplied the world's green energy revolution. But first, he needed to convince his parliament, his people, and the international community that Botswana was ready for this massive transformation. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the following week, and the whole world would be watching to see if this small African nation could pull off what many considered impossible. News of the potential deal spread through Gaborone like wildfire. Sarah Modise, a single mother working 2 jobs to support her 3 children, first heard about it while cleaning offices in the government building. The security guard, unable to contain his excitement, whispered to her about trucks full of foreign engineers arriving at the northern mining sites. Sarah's heart raced as she processed this information. For years, she had watched her neighbors leave Botswana in search of better opportunities in South Africa and other countries. The thought that her homeland might finally offer the prosperity she dreamed of for her children seemed too wonderful to believe. At the same time, traditional chief Kagosi Tawana was having very different thoughts in his village near the proposed mining sites. His ancestors had lived on this land for over 300 years, and the idea of foreign companies digging up sacred grounds filled him with deep concern. The elderly chief had seen promises before, and he remembered how previous mining ventures had disrupted communities without delivering the benefits they promised. Dr. James Morrison, a British geologist working for a competing mining company, received an urgent call from his headquarters in London. His employers had just learned about Botswana's negotiations with the Asian Consortium, and they were furious that such a valuable discovery had slipped past their intelligence networks. Morrison was ordered to travel to Botswana immediately to assess whether his company could make a counteroffer. Meanwhile, in the capital city, economics professor Dr. Naledi Setshiro was analyzing the potential deal with growing excitement and concern. Her calculations showed that if managed properly, the mineral wealth could transform Botswana into the Singapore of Africa. However, she also understood the risks of the resource curse that had plagued other African nations rich in natural resources. President Masisi spent his days in non-stop meetings with cabinet ministers, trying to address every possible concern about the deal. Finance Minister Peggy Sarami raised questions about the country's capacity to manage such massive revenues without triggering inflation or corruption. Defense Minister Shah Kagathi worried about security implications of having such valuable assets, knowing that neighboring countries might view Botswana's newfound wealth with envy. The international media began paying attention to the story. CNN and BBC sent reporters to Botswana, and suddenly the world was learning about this peaceful nation that most people could not even locate on a map. The coverage brought both opportunities and pressures as global powers realized they had overlooked a potential game-changer in the heart of Africa. Chen Wei-ming found himself under intense scrutiny as competing companies tried to undermine his consortium's credibility. Australian mining executives questioned his environmental claims, while Canadian competitors suggested that his technology was unproven. Chen knew that any sign of weakness could cause the entire deal to collapse, so he doubled down on his commitments and flew in additional technical experts to demonstrate his consortium's capabilities. Local businessman Thabo Mogal saw opportunity in the chaos. He had built a successful transportation company over 15 years, and he realized that the mining project would create enormous demand for logistics services. Thabo began quietly meeting with potential partners and investors, hoping to position his company as a key supplier to the consortium. Environmental activist Grace Ntila organized community meetings to discuss the mining project's potential impact on local ecosystems. She had studied environmental science in South Africa and understood both the benefits and dangers of large-scale mining operations. Grace wanted to ensure that Botswana's unique wildlife and landscapes would be protected, even as the country pursued economic development. The pressure on President Masisi intensified when opposition leader Dumilang Salishando demanded that Parliament have full access to all details of the proposed agreement. Salishando argued that such a significant deal should not be negotiated in secret, and he threatened to organize protests if the government did not provide complete transparency. Religious leaders across the country held special prayer services, asking for divine guidance as their nation faced this momentous decision. Pastor John Molefe of the largest church in Gaborone preached about the responsibility that comes with unexpected blessings, reminding his congregation that great wealth could be either a blessing or a curse depending on how it was used. As the week progressed, rumors and speculation filled social media and coffee shop conversations throughout Botswana. Some claimed the deal was too good to be true and predicted it would fall through at the last minute. Others worried that signing the agreement would make Botswana too dependent on foreign companies and technology. Chen's consortium faced its own internal challenges as some investors expressed concerns about political stability in Africa and the complexity of operating in a country with limited mining infrastructure. However, Chen remained confident that Botswana's stable democracy and educated population made it an ideal partner for this ambitious venture. President Masisi realized that the success or failure of this deal would define not only his presidency, but potentially the next century of Botswana's history. The weight of representing 2 million people's hopes and dreams kept him awake most nights, as he reviewed every clause and considered every possible consequence of moving forward with the agreement.